In this section, we're going to start by working on our first array helper. So first off, we're going to try to figure out what I mean by the term array helper, and then we're going to talk about our first one, which is the forEach helper. To get started, I want to write out some very classic ES5 code, or code that you might be writing today. And this is going to be a very simplistic example to get started with, but I just want to make sure that we're on the same page and we're talking about kind of iteration through an array using a for loop. So for this first example, I want to make an array of strings, and we'll say that I'm just going to make an array of colors, red, blue, green. And then for iterating through this loop, I want to write a for loop that's going to walk through every element in the loop and console log it to the console. So we're just going to log it to the console. If I was writing very classic ES5 code, or even earlier, I might write a for loop that looks a little something like this. And I'm sure this is something that looks familiar to you. It's something that we've all written a billion times before. Oops, talking and typing is sometimes challenging. There we go. So I've got my very classic for loop here. We start off with an iterator of I. We walk into the body of the for loop, execute the body. We then increment, see if we still are inside the loop or within the bounds of the loop, and then execute the body again. Very classic for loop again. So this is the kind of syntax or the approach that we want to move away from as much as possible. And you're probably sitting there thinking, Stephen, why would we want to move away from this? We've been writing for loops since the beginning of time. Why would I not want to write for loops all day? And this is going to be a question that we're going to come back to many, many times, and I'm going to try in many different ways to convince you to not write for loops anymore wherever possible. So writing for loops to work with our data is not bad, right? It works. This definitely walks through every element in the array and console logs it. But I want you to sit there for a second and I want you to think, what are all the different ways that writing a for loop can go wrong, okay? What are all the different ways that it can go wrong? So there's many different pieces of code here on the screen right now that are prone to typos, and that is the key here. There are many elements of code that are prone to making just very small, tiny mistakes. We have to remember the order of arguments for the for loop. We got a semicolon between each one, which is kind of dissimilar from any other type of syntax in JavaScript. Once we're inside the loop, we need to remember that the current element is colors at I. And in general, there's just a lot of extra pieces of code, like we got the parens, the curly braces, all these different elements that are sitting on the screen that our eyes have to look at. Now, I'm not saying, hey, we shouldn't be writing any code because just having code on the screen is hard to understand it. No, the case I'm trying to make here is that the more logic that we stuff into just a single line of code, the more challenging it is for our future engineers who are coming in working on a project to understand what's going on. So that is the kind of running topic that we're going to be going with here. Writing a for loop is great. It always works, but it's sometimes really challenging to figure out what's going wrong. So with that in mind, we're going to introduce our first helper here, our first array helper. The purpose of every single array helper that we're going to be using is to help with iteration over an array. Okay, so let's put the code up on the screen and then we'll talk exactly about what's going on. Right underneath the existing for loop, I'm going to add colors.forEach, and then I'm going to pass a function like so. Okay, so pause. We just put crazy code up on the screen. Let's take a second and talk about exactly what's going on. So let's go over this on a line-by-line basis, and for right now we're just going to kind of forget the for loop that's here right now. So step one, at the very top, we created an array of strings and assigned it to colors. So colors is now an array. On line 7 down here, we call colors.forEach. forEach is an array helper method. Any array that we have access to a method on it called forEach. When we call the forEach method, we pass in an anonymous function, which is the internal argument here to the forEach call. So we're passing in a function. This function gets called one time for every element in the array. And whatever is inside the function, boom, it happens. Okay, so that's kind of a description of the code structure, but it doesn't quite explain what's going on behind the scenes. So let's take a look at a diagram real quick here and try to figure out what's going on. So we're going to kind of walk through two steps of the for loop here, of the for each, excuse me. On the left-hand side, we have a diagram of the colors array. So the colors array is this big outside rectangle, and inside of it, we've got red, green, and blue. 3 elements, right? So the for each helper takes the first element in the array and it passes it to the iterator function. And so this is kind of starting to bring in a little bit of strange terminology here. An iterator function is the function that we passed into for each. So this right here is my iterator function, and we'll be using that term a lot of time going into the future as well. After red is passed to the iterator function, the iterator function runs, goes off and does something, whatever's inside that function, and then it returns. After the iterator function returns, we take the second element in the array, which is green, and we pass it to the iterator function. It runs, and then boom, something goes on. And then the final run through, blue gets passed to the iterator function, it runs, and that's it. So the entire key here, very simple, not anything to kind of overcomplicate here. For every element inside of the colors array, we take the element and pass it to this inside function, and then once inside of it, we can do absolutely anything we want with this value that we so chose. So if for each behaves the same way as a for loop, right now I'm trying to tell you here that these two snippets of code are completely equivalent. Why would we ever bother using a for each, right? Why would I bother using for each? Why can't I just use a for loop all the time? So the answer is that this is dramatically less code that we have to write. There's a lot less on the screen. There's nearly the same amount of characters, but I'm going to argue that we don't have anywhere near as much logic as we do when we have to set up the bounds of the array. So I know that if you're looking at the syntax for the first time, inside the for each right here, or if you generally like writing for loops more, it might not look very forgiving, but trust me, this is one of the things where the more you look at it, the more you're going to like it. Okay, let's take a quick break on our first for array helper here, and then come back and look at some more complicated examples of for each in the next section.